Hello, this is Danny from CGDREAMS. Today we're going to be looking at how to correctly create displacement maps inside Zbrush to be used with Redshift. Now there are a few things, there are a few gotchas, and there's a way in which you should do it in order to avoid any problems. Fortunate for you, I've gone through all of these problems before and I've managed to get around them. So that's what I'm going to be doing in this video. When you bring your model into Zbrush, there's one thing that you must do right away, and that is to store your morph target. The reason why you have to store the morph target is because the second you start to subdivide the mesh, your base level, that's level 1, will be slightly changed. To demonstrate this, I'm going to show you this now. So I'm going to go to my morph target on the right hand side here, and I'm going to click on store. So that's what it would be like when you store it. Now I'm going to subdivide it a couple of times, so Control and D, and now I'm going to go back down to level 1 again, Shift and D. Now you would assume that the mesh is exactly the same as the mesh that you brought in, but it's not. This base level mesh is now smoothed. So now when I click on the switch, just notice how this changes. You see that? It's expanded. If you don't do this task of storing the morph target, when it comes to creating the displacement map, it's going to create a displacement map based upon that mesh, not this one. And this is really important because when you bring your maps into your external 3D application, it needs to be applied to exactly the same mesh the way it was between there and in Zbrush. Scale has a funny thing in relation with Zbrush. If your model is too big or too small, this can have an effect on the way that it generates the displacement map. Now normally this isn't a problem because you just bring your mesh into Zbrush and then Zbrush will deal with the scale for you. You can normally tell whether the scale's right for Zbrush because when you go into your, not your subtool, but your geometry, you open up the size, and the size should be roughly 2.000 something. If it's showing that, then it means that you're working within the tolerance of the way that Zbrush works best. This normally means you can create displacement maps straight away without any problems. But the problem happens when you're starting off with a mesh which is fine inside Zbrush. You send it over to another program and then you rescale it. If you then send it back over into Zbrush at the new scale, this can start to mess things up. So there is one way that you can deal with this, and that is to go to the deformation and then you click on Unify. Now be warned that this will only do this on this selected subtool. So what you would need to do if you've got loads of subtools is go to your Z plugin, and I'm just going to dock this to the left here, and if you to look over here you'll see this transpose master. If you click on T-pose mesh, what will happen is it will temporarily bring everything into one single mesh. Once you've done that, if you press on the Unify, then it will rescale everything at the same time. Now this kind of workflow isn't the same kind of workflow that you would use using the GoZ function where you would automatically send it over. The GoZ would automatically deal with the scale problems and issues. Thankfully inside Zbrush there is a plugin called Scale Master. So if you just look over to the left hand side where I've docked this palette, this Scale Master will enable you to rescale your model in a way in which it unifies everything inside the scene. You normally know when there's something a bit wrong, and that is when your brush scale is either really too big when you've actually got a small level, or when you've got a very low level like this and your size of your brush is huge. There's a couple of things you can do about this. First of all, you could deal with this one, and I urge you to look at the documentation for this Scale Master, because it does deal with some of these issues that I've talked about with scale. And the other thing that you can do is you can go to your preferences, and then in the drawer you've got the ability to bring your scale of your brush down slightly. So this would be the case that if your model is really huge and you're right the way down to say 3, draw size 3, and your cursor is massive, you can adjust this in here. But this doesn't deal with the issue with having a model either too big or too small. If you do, it can have some problems, and then that's one thing that you need to be aware of. So if your displacement maps are coming out with hardly any grayscale difference, that's one of the reasons for it. And I found I've got into that trap quite a few times. So just to recap, when you bring your model into ZBrush, you should be seeing it automatically unified to a scale of around about 2. And you should also see that if you go to your export settings down here, you should have a figure in here. Now this figure in here won't reflect this scale in which it's inside ZBrush. This is because I've scaled the object inside, in my particular case, Cinema 4D, before I brought it into ZBrush. That is the best workflow by far if you was to get your model to the correct scale before you start to do your sculpting. That way you're always going to have ZBrush understanding that there's a different scale on export than there is to the scale while it's inside ZBrush. And what it will do is it will take into account the displacement maps when it creates them, that it's going to be exported at a different scale. Assuming that you've got a good UV map, which is absolutely essential, and assuming that you're ready to do the sculpting part of things, this is where you need to have a workflow for your sculpting, and it's a good idea to go into layers and start to store your layers. You don't really want to subdivide your mesh crazy high at this stage. You just want to go over your primary forms, your secondary forms, but this video is not about the sculpting procedure, but I thought I'd just mention this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead, I'm going to add a few layers. I've stored my morph target already, and I'm going to subdivide it, and then I'm going to do some basic sculpting on there, and then I'll be back. So you've done all your sculpting, and then you're going to be preparing now to do the displacement. Now if, like in this particular case, you end up deforming the mesh way more than just simply sculpting detail, then it may be the case that you want to update the model inside your external application to be your new base mesh. Now the way that I like to do this is I like to push into a new layer inside ZBrush, and then with that new layer I use this feature found in the geometry, and it's called cage. What it does is it will push some of the higher details into the lower sub-D level, and essentially it will basically inflate it slightly. The reason why you would want to try to do this is because it will hold more of the volume and it will rely less on the displacement map. That's providing that you create that displacement map from that same level. So I'm happy to stay with how this is, but if I wanted to, I could push it higher using this cage feature. The reason why you would want to add a layer is because initially the cage will actually add too much of a volume to it, and you can then basically use the layer to bring down that inflation in it. But I'm going to keep things simple. I'm going to keep to where this is right now. This is going to be my new base mesh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my morph target. If I switch now, I will go back to the original. You can see it's quite a bit different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep to this version now, and then I'm going to delete the morph target and then store it. Now what's important at this point is that I'm going to make sure that I export this or use GoZ to update my scene inside Cinema 4D or your external application that you're going to be applying the maps to. Now just as a reminder, when we looked in the geometry and we looked at the size, you can see here it's very close to 2, which means that Zbrush has automatically scaled it to be uniform to its own scale it prefers. But when you go down and look at the export settings, as I've already shown you now, you can see here that it's got this different scale. This means that when you go to export this model, it's going to export it the scale that it should be according to the scene that it came from. This is why it's really important that you adopt a workflow where you scale the mesh first before you start to subdivide it inside Zbrush and start sculpting. So in other words, do your modeling, do your volume work even inside Zbrush, but don't do any major detail work. Send it over to your external application where you can accurately get the correct world scale of that character, and then rename. That's quite important. Rename the file so Zbrush has got no recollection of it ever being inside Zbrush before. It's got no files there. That's in case of GoZ. Then it will look at the mesh from a new and it will scale it up, and then it will automatically make sure that this export scale is correct. If you follow this kind of workflow, you're not going to have any problems, and when it comes to generating displacement maps, you're going to find that everything's going to be working just as it should. So back into the scene within Cinema 4D, I'm going to update the mesh because I've made some changes to the volume of the mesh that I want it to be replacing the current mesh that's in the scene. This is so that the mesh in the scene is matching the mesh inside Zbrush. If I wanted to keep the mesh that's in the scene right now, then I would simply use the morph target inside Zbrush that way. As long as they're matching, that's the main thing. So I'm going to merge the mesh into this scene, and by default it's centimeters. And then what you should see is you should see the mesh come in, and it should be the exact right scale of the previous mesh. If so far you're following this to this point and everything's working as it is, then you're in a good position to do your displacement maps. So we're back over into Zbrush, and there's two areas that you can create a displacement map from. If you're going to be creating multiple maps at once, or UDIMs, UDIM texture maps that is, then you would want to use the plugin over here, and this is called Multi-Map Exporter. Especially if you're going to be adopting the 32-bit floating point type displacement maps. But I'll cover both of these. For the case of this purpose, we're going to stick to the multi-map exporter, but just to show you that you can also go to the right of the interface where you've got displacement map, and you can create a quick displacement map from here. You may want to do your 32-bit ones over inside the multi-map exporter because you've got a few more options that are quite important. So let's go over to the multi-mapper exporter. We got the displacement turned on. I've got a size that I put in there, 6096. That's a 6K map basically. We want to go to our export options, and in the displacement map this is where we're going to find the displacement map options in there. So at the moment it's set up, as you can see there, for 16-bit displacement map. Now what's really important is that when you're using UDIMs, you want to use the 16-bit scale, have this turned on. If you don't do that, what it will do is it will actually create each UDIM separately, and then it will actually have a different grade of black and white, or from the grayscale values. What will happen is you're going to start to see seams in between your UDIMs. So by adopting this use of this button here, it will make sure that the displacements are consistent when you're using UDIMs. But I'm not going to be using UDIMs in this particular case. So what I want to draw your attention to is the mid. You can see here mid is 0.5. Well, this is perfect for a 16-bit displacement map. This is because there is a negative and a positive value of the grayscale. With a 32-bit, it will start from black and go from black on its way up to white. So it works a little bit different for that, and I'll show you how this is set up inside Cinema 4D for Redshift, although it's the same, I assume, with other applications regarding Redshift. Inside Redshift, by default, it's set up for 32-bit displacement maps, but I will show you why in a minute. So first of all, let's export a 16-bit displacement map. You can see the settings that I've got here. Inside Zbrush, it typically will flip the UVs the wrong way around, so this is why you would have this button turned on. The switch morph targets, it's always been broken in the past, so you may want to check out to see whether that works or not still, but I turn it on if I've got a morph target, if I have a morph target stored. What should happen in theory is that if you're going up and down your sub-D levels and your base mesh is smoothed, and you do not want that smoothed level there, what it should do is it should automatically switch the morph target for you. But I tend to keep this turned on, and I'll make sure that I'm always working from the base mesh that I should be, which means I won't go up in a sub-D level right now. I'll stay at the lowest sub-D level right now. If for some reason you've lost your morph target, all you have to do is go to the tools, then go to import, and then import the model that you've exported already for your target application. It will bring it in, update the base mesh, and then you can simply go ahead and then store the morph target. So with that said, we're going to create a displacement map. So we will see how it looks in a minute, and then we will come back and apply it inside Redshift. And to create this, we click on the Create All Maps button. I'm going to create a brand new material from scratch, even though I've already got one for this model. I'm going to go to Create and then go to Redshift, and then from here I'm going to select my material. I'm going to rename this so I know what material we're dealing with, and I'm going to drag and drop this onto the model or directly within the object manager itself. Now we're going to double click on this and open this up. Now just to note that I'm working in the Cinema 4D's own node space. If you are not working in R21, you won't see this, but everything is exactly the same. This just looks a little bit more fancier, and it's got a couple of extra options which I won't be using. So don't be put off if you're not seeing this node editor looking exactly the same as this. So the material, the first thing I would do is I would set the roughness up around about 0.5. We don't want a shiny model in this particular case. I'm not going to set anything up other than displacement. So let's go over to here where the assets are, and we're going to type in this, and it comes up straight away. Just to note, you've also got another node there called Displacement Blender. This is for if you've got multiple displacements, and I will talk a bit about that after the main part of this video, just for an extra bonus to the video. Now we need to plug in the displacement, so we're going to plug this in to the output of our shader. Inside the displacement you'll see these change range settings. For a 32-bit displacement map you don't have to touch anything. This is because a 32-bit displacement map starts with a value of black, which is 0, and it will go as high as 1 for white. When it comes to 16-bit displacements, we always start from a value of 50% grey, and then it can basically go from 50% grey to a very dark of black and white. So it can go either way, but it always starts from the center point of 50% grey. So as noted, when we go into the material in here, I put in this roughness. You see this 0.5. Okay, this is basically saying inside Redshift 0.5 is 50%, and you can actually see the slider is halfway. This is exactly the same when it comes to displacement. If we want to have a 50% grey range that we're needing for a 16-bit displacement, we type in minus 0.5. This is because this is our minimum. Our maximum will be 0.5, and that's all we need to do for this. Now, according to the scale of the object inside ZBrush to the scale that's inside your target application is to the scale that you're going to need in here. If everything's all good and fine, and that ZBrush has detected that the model was coming at a different scale, but it's automatically adjusted it inside ZBrush, then you're going to find that ZBrush is going to generate it correctly with a scale of 1. So we will see how things look. So to get the texture into here, there's two ways you can do it. You can either start to type texture and drag and drop this in here, or you can go to your folder that you've got your displacement map in, and you can just drag and drop. I'm just doing this from my other screen. You can drag and drop this from your folder, and it automatically sets it up for you and adds a node. So that's an easier way of doing it. If I was to select this, you can see where your texture map gets loaded into. Now it's important that when you're working with TIFF files or EXR that it's got a gamma of 1. If for some reason you're in doubt, you can enable this gamma override, and then it will automatically, unless you turn on RGB, which you don't want to do, it will be a gamma of 1. I always have this turned on just to make sure that it's definitely got the gamma of 1, otherwise you're going to have some inconsistencies. We're going to now plug this into the displacement, texture map. If you're using this particular node editor, you can see everything's color coded. So that's plugged into there. So now we've got the displacement plugged into our output, which is our shader, and then we've got this displacement map plugged into the displacement node. There's nothing you need to do in here. Everything's done from here and from the actual tag that's put on your model inside here. So I'm going to apply this to the model. I've already done it, so that should be okay to go now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up the IPR and see what we get. So as you can see here, the default values that I've got in there, other than the 0.5 that I had to change, has loaded up fine. It all has come through the exact detail that I would have expected it to come through. So this is a good start. This is a very good start. If you find for some reason that it's not coming through very well, it will definitely be down to a scale issue. You can go into your material, let's bring this over here, and you can actually change this scale. And as I mentioned as well, you can also go to this tag and you can adjust some scale settings in here as well, but you need to basically try to work with one or the other, otherwise it can get a bit confusing. Now with this enable auto bump mapping, if I was to go a little bit closer, we should see some of that detail coming through. So you can see here it's coming through exactly as it was inside Zbrush. Now I intentionally disabled a layer inside Zbrush, and the layer that I disabled was the high frequency detail. And the reason why I do this, and it's not mandatory that you do this, is because I like to have the detail in a separate displacement map. This means that I can use the blender, the displacement blender, to dial in the strength of the detail separate from the displacement itself. It's nice to be able to have that kind of level of control. So we've headed back into Zbrush, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to generate the high frequency detail, and this is why I store things in layers. So I'm going to go up to the higher layer, and before I do that, just going to make sure I've definitely got this stored, and then I'm going to go to my layers. I'm going to go up to the highest level, and then when I get there I should be able to turn on the detail layers. As you can see, the detail layers have come through now, and what you can do is you can go to this area over here for the displacement, and you can choose what level you feel that the detail needs to be taken from. So as an example here, I can go back a couple of levels. Let's go back to about there, and then I'm going to get a displacement from level 4. So I'm going to go to my sub D level 4 over here in the displacement multi-map exporter. I'm going to go back to the lowest level here, make sure that I switch my morph target in case that's changed. It did slightly, and I'm going to generate the maps from level 4 upwards. Now back into Cinema 4D, I'm going to go to my displacement blender and I'm going to plug this in. This goes into the displacement, and then this displacement, this is the base level, is going to be plugged into one of the layers here. This will go to the base layer, and then I'm going to drag and drop my detail map into here. So this map is going to look a bit different from the original map. You see there, there's hardly anything there at all. This is because there's not much depth, but there's more detail there than anything else. And then what we're going to do is we're going to plug this into layer 1. And wrong one. Just copy this. I'll just hold down the control key, because we still need another displacement node in there. This is so we've got independent control. Then we're going to plug this into our blender. We're going to go layer 1 or layer 0. Now we're going to go into the blender. We're going to have this set as an additive mode, which means it's going to add to the base level. And then what we're going to get is we're going to get the detail to come through. And before we can even see that detail, just need to make sure that we've got the blend put up there. Now if you was to look now over to here, you can see all the details come through. Now what I just did do there, just to push it a little bit harder, I actually put a scale of 2 in, You should be able to put a scale of 1 in and see the detail that it was like inside ZBrush. There we go. So by doing it this way, you're going to get the detail separate from the main displacement, and then you're going to be able to control the blend between the two and even push multiple levels of detail. Maybe you've got the higher frequencies, the creases, and you can divide them all up to get the best results that you want, rather than doing it and baking it all down into one map and then deciding that it's not quite right and you have to keep on going backwards and forwards between ZBrush to regenerate maps after maps. This is the better way to do it. Now we're going to create 32-bit displacements. This time I'm going to actually go to my layers. I'm going to include the detail in with this. The procedure is exactly the same as before. You can simply just go in there and either turn your detail levels on or off and create separate maps, or have them bake all into one. But I'm going to bake them into one just to save a little bit of time. So I'm going to enable these. I'm going to go down to my lowest sub-D level, switch my morph target, and then we're going to go over to our displacement exporter to set things up a little bit different for our 32-bit. So for 32-bit, what we want is we want everything the same as before, other than we want 32-bit. The mid-level should be at 0, so we turn this to 0, and I'm going to choose EXR. Everything else should be the same as before. We can now go and create our displacement map. I want to go from level 1. Back over into ZBrush, we're going to go and back into our material. I'm going to drag and drop my EXR file into here, and we're just going to swap it out. The difference here though is that your map is going to look very different to a 16-bit. You can see we've got a lot of black in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just get rid of this displacement blender, and I'm going to plug in the map directly into the displacement, and inside, well no, we need to go into a displacement node still. Always need to do that. Into there. We don't want the blend. That's the one we want. Okay, we're going to go into here, and then from there into our displacement, and we just need to change these settings. Instead of 0.5, we need to go from 0 to 1. This is how it was originally, and now it's plugged in. We will be able to see our displacement in action. So now what you're seeing is you're seeing the 32-bit version, and you can see it's working absolutely fine. We've got the detail baked into this time, but it's pretty simple really. As you can see, there's not a lot of difference between the quality between 32-bit and 16-bit. When you're kind of working at this kind of level, it's not really the super high frequency detail. So I hope you've learned something from this, and you can see just how easy it is to work between ZBrush and Redshift. There is just one other option that I just want to mention inside ZBrush, and that is found in the displacement for multi-mapper exporter, and it's called Get Scale. This kind of tries to compensate when you've got a model which is extremely large or extremely small, and ZBrush tries to find out how much it needs to adjust the displacement map when it's actually creating it. I found that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I always adopt the workflow as I've shown you today, where I'll make sure that the scale's right from the beginning before I start to subdivide and really go into sculpting some detail.